What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the Nightmares Podcast, where we talk about all things horror, movies, television shows, music, and whatever the fuck we want to talk about. Well, then we talk about it. So I'm here with the usual suspects. It is Z-Man Killer right over there. What's up? Not the worst one I gave you.
It's the way you said it. Just, you gotta put some emphasis on the killer, but just... Oh, God, you fucking... All right, yeah, introduce Brandon
and then B-Man and our sound guru, Colin. Today's topic was actually brought to my attention by, this is going to be a long line here, by my girlfriend's sister's husband, who got in a conversation with me about what the difference is between... Brandon's following. He's like following the bouncing ball as it goes. What is the real difference between a thriller and a horror movie? And I was like, oh, that's really interesting. And I thought originally it would be an easier question to answer. And I'm like, you know what? I better bring this up in a podcasting topic, because it's already been brought up several times, because the old argument is Silence of the Lambs. It's not if Silence of the Lambs is a good movie or not. It's whether or not it's a thriller or a horror.
It is a thriller.
I think it's a horror. But
you're wrong.
But I want to give more credibility.
It's a thriller.
To horror.
Colin, do you think...
I haven't seen it, actually.
Oh, dude.
Full disclaimer, there's a lot of movies that I should have seen, but I've never seen, so...
We'll make you a list.
Noted.
If you guys want to educate me on movies, it's not going to be very hard.
We'll make you a list.
There are a lot of movies in the world. It's understandable.
He's got a point. Continue.
So I really wanted to bring this up, even outside of that discussion about Silence of the Lambs. I think isn't always explained what the difference is, and also, too, what their relationships are to each other. Where do you draw the line between thriller and horror? And there's a lot of different things, and I didn't really have a good answer for them. We kind of discussed it around, but I really wanted to bring it to the group and really talk about it. I know Zach had a couple good explanations before we started the podcast.
He actually had a really good explanation when we were at dinner the other night.
Yeah, and so I'll let you go first, Zach, so you can talk about what you think.
Without looking up the actual definitions of horror and thriller, the way I like to describe it is a thriller is like a roller coaster ride. It's going to end when the movie ends, but you remember the experience. It was exhilarating, thrilling, and you remember it. It was a fun time, but after it's done, it's done. Horror, that's something that sticks with you. Horror is something that's meant to kind of like scare you and just leave a lasting impact. So, hi, Colin. Horror, it's something that sticks with you, leaves an impact, leaves an image. It leaves something that sticks with you. So, to me, that is essentially the fundamental difference. Horror, it's going to stick with you for a while. Thriller, once it's done, it's done.
Well, you know what the funny thing is, and I hate to bring this up with, by that rationale, for me, Silence of the Lambs would be a horror. Because there's several scenes and several things that stick with me. And yeah, there's an upwards mobility, but there's plenty of things that stick with me. Especially a lot of the shit with Buffalo Bill, which I know for a fact has actually happened to some extent. And then also, too, is when, he fucking skins that guy and hangs him up in the cell. And then also, too, the whole switcheroo and then him just being out in the world like fucking Michael Myers. So there are plenty of things that stuck with me. And there's plenty of things that stick with me that I guess a lot of people would traditionally say that it's a thriller rather than a horror. So I understand where you're coming from, but I guess for me, that even proves more of my case of why Silence of the Lambs is a horror movie to me, because there are a lot of things that stick with me. And yeah, it's a thrill ride, it goes in and out, but there's a lot of things that very permanently stick with me, and also too, a lot with, like I said, the Buffalo Bill shit, and then her being trapped in there, and also too that one scene too that was really horrifying for me is when she's screaming and then he screams back at her, making fun of her, and I'm like, that shit could actually happen. So that really, really stuck with me. So that's thus brings to the complicated nature of what is the difference between a thriller and a horror. I think it's very complicated, but it is a good fucking way to distinguish the two. Yeah. But there are some shit that sticks with me that people would traditionally say is a thriller rather than a horror.
Well, to add on to your comment there, so it's also going to depend on the person, because you and I we're going to react differently to certain scenarios in movies, you know.
course.
I can walk through the bowels of hell where there's flesh-covered walls and eyeballs and random bodily fluids just coming out of the things and walk down there with a smile on my face. Whereas you'd probably be like, oh my god, my country club uniform, no!
Well, I would be pissed that I got some blood on my fucking clothes, but besides that, I would be pretty amused, to say the least. But you know what, that would be so, over dramatic, and it's like Hellraiser and like and anything to do with Nightmare on Elm Street.
Yeah.
It's so over the top and everything else, and you go, well, this is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
I think when it gets a little bit more into reality, I think that there's some even more horrific elements there.
I've said after the first Nightmare movie and Friday movie, they just go into the realm of, okay, this is just, you're going along for the ride at this point. Like, they're fun movies, you're already on the roller coaster, and you're just fucking going with it. Especially with the Friday the 13th movies. So,
What do you consider Jaws a horror movie or a thriller?
thriller.
Interesting. Okay.
Thriller for most of the movie. There's only a few parts of it where I'd actually consider it a horror movie. Like, I think the best part where that movie can be considered a horror movie is when, the cage scene.
Okay.
Let me throw this out there. Because, like Zach has said, there are scenes in Jaws that can be horror scenes, but he doesn't consider it to be a horror movie. So it's just because a movie has horror scenes in it doesn't mean it's a horror movie.
Ooh.
Like the T-Rex scene in Jurassic Park. You could tell me that they use every horror trick in the book in that scene, and I'll agree with you if that scene is a horror scene.
Yeah.
Jurassic Park itself as a whole is not a horror movie.
Yeah.
So that's an interesting thing about where's the tipping balance though, and I think that's where I want to kind of get to is when does it get to a point where it has crossed the line, or maybe the line doesn't exist. Maybe the line is very personalized and there's no really standard to live by.
I would definitely say it definitely depends on the person. For most part, when a movie's trying to be a horror movie, like look at all the fucking Conjuring movies, Paranormal Activity movies. Those are clearly trying to be into horror movies and leave a lasting impact with you, and some that could actually scare the ever-living shit out of you.
Yeah.
And I would say even, the classic slashes try to do that for the most part. But again, it's all going to depend on the person, because somebody like me, I'm going to watch those with a big fucking smile on my face. Whereas another person, they're going to watch and be like, oh.
The funny thing is that, so would you say that you enjoy horror more than you enjoy thrillers?
I enjoy them both equally.
Okay.
Because that's the thing. To me, it's like, because I'm not scared of movies. So to find a real, true horror film for me is damn near impossible. I could find horror games that definitely have that impact, but because I'm able to separate myself when watching a movie, I'm like, to me, it's just a movie. I'm going for the story and the visuals, and I'm just going to just relax and have a great time.
Fair enough. I think it's getting harder and harder. The more you make movies, the harder it gets to be fully invested in it. Like
kind of like when I first started getting into the industry, it was just like when you start noticing every little thing, and like most of the tricks in the book and stuff like that, you're just like, you notice a lot more. But over time, you learn to kind of separate yourself from that.
Yeah. What about you, Brennan? What are some of your thoughts on the differences between them, and where's that line?
It's kind of hard to say, because like whenever I hear this, I think about I think it's what Tarantino said about Grindhouse, and that Planet Terror is horror because it has all that supernatural stuff, and it has stuff that just can't happen in it. Whereas Death Proof is thriller because theoretically that movie could happen. And so for a while, that was kind of just like, because that was really the only explanation I'd heard from anybody for a good while in my life. So for a while, I just kind of used that as my division line. But there are movies that just doesn't work on. And then it's like, as much as I agree with Zach's philosophy of horror is meant to stick with you and everything, Friday the 13th Part 3.
That's why
that movie's ridiculous, but there's no question that it's a horror movie.
Yeah, that's why I also say it's also going to depend on the person.
Yeah.
Because there are people who are still legitimately scared of stuff like that. Like, they're going to see Friday the 13th, and they're not going to be like us.
I'm not talking about Friday the 13th. I'm talking about...
Well, just in... just like in general.
Let me go a little more extreme here. Freddy's dead.
Yeah. Because it's another reason why I also included, like, the first movie in each of their respective series were meant to be straight-up horror films, and you could see as they went on, they just took it and went to town with it.
Yeah. But then, of course, there's the other subgenres, like horror comedy.
Yeah.
So it's... I don't know. Like I said in a previous podcast, everybody has their own line, and they can move that line wherever they want. Like, looking at the posters behind you guys right now. Okay, Friday the 13th. Even though there's nothing supernatural in that movie, I would call that a horror movie. Exorcist, I would call a horror movie. Jaws, horror scenes, but I would call that a thriller. Scream could definitely happen, but I would still classify that in horror instead of thriller. But of course, you can mix the genres too. But if I had to say which one, but if you ask me, hey Brandon, is Scream a thriller or horror? I would say horror first. Mm-hmm. Lost Boys, vampires, that's horror. Creature from Black Lagoon, that's horror as well.
Yeah. But some people would, So I think it's interesting because because Zach, you're defining a thriller as something that is not as intense as a horror. It's the Diet Coke of horror.
Yeah, that's another good way to put it.
But that's the funny thing is because personally I think there's a lot of thrillers that I've watched that are just as impactful and everything else, and it has nothing to do with necessarily being scared or I can't handle it. I think that there are a lot of thrillers that are very, very impactful, but they don't cross whatever imaginary line into horror that it necessarily exists.
One phrase I've often heard mentioned in relation to thrillers is edge of your seat. So it's like I've always called them suspense movies instead of thrillers. Like it still feels weird for me to call it a thriller right now. Especially when we have a Michael Jackson song called Thriller that has zombies, which is a horror element. So so I've always called them suspense movies. And it's like I'm thinking of like Alfred Hitchcock was considered the master of suspense. Not the master of horror, the master of suspense. Because like you think of movies like Stranger on a Train. Is this guy going to get away with the murder? Rope. Are those two guys going to get away with having that dead body in their trunk? Rear Window. When James Stewart suspects his neighbor across the way of being a murderer, is he going to find out? And then there's, that guy found out that James Stewart is onto him. What's going to happen next?
But the funny thing is I would consider Psycho horror. But I would not consider. I would consider
Psycho horror as well.
Correct. So and that's the funny thing is it's Alfred Hitchcock.
But Psycho is not his only movie.
Well, correct. No, of course. But we're giving examples of a thriller, and everything else. What's the difference between Psycho and Rear Window? I think that's the big thing, and those are probably very, very clear examples because Hitchcock has a very specific style. You can tell it's a Hitchcock movie.
Yeah.
So where's that line? Like between Rear Window and Psycho, because both are about murderers, and both are about enclosed spaces, one central location of where this is all happening. They're similar in that regard. What's the defining factor that separates that from a thriller into a horror?
Good question. Don't have an answer.
So I'm just going to add something a little bit onto all this. So let's take our good old Exorcist poster back here, for example.
Which actually, this is another interesting one, too, because William Friedkin directed that as a drama, not as a horror movie.
Exactly. It was intended to be a drama movie, not a horror movie. Mm-hmm. But everybody who came out of that damn movie was terrified of it. Your family members, for example. My family members, for example. Almost everybody I knew growing up was terrified of this fucking movie,
Colin,
but it was intended to be a drama.
Yeah, that's the funny thing is it's often that was an old piece of acting advice and everything else. It's not your responsibility to judge the character; that's the audience's responsibility, and it's the same thing with every story. Colin, did I ever tell that story on the podcast or tell you that story about my family with the Exorcist? I'll say it real quick.
You've told it on the podcast, but I don't think you've told Colin.
So I would tell Colin real quick. My Uncle Tommy went to go see The Exorcist in theaters back in the day. And back then, obviously Italian neighborhood and everything else, the ladies of the neighborhood would have prayer weeks, prayer meetings, and they would have a statue of the Virgin Mary and they would trade places. Like once a week they would meet, and then the Virgin Mary statue would be in a different person's house, and it happened to be Tommy's mom's turn that week, and they get together, they have a prayer meeting, and they have coffee in the kitchen and everything else. It was a couple hours later, and the ladies had already left, and Tommy's mom was sitting on the kitchen table back in the city when you walked in through the kitchen. And she's having a cigarette and a cup of coffee, and Tommy walks in with like a 10,000-mile stare, just like this shit. She's like, oh, Tommy, how was the movie? And he literally he looked past her into the living room with the Virgin Mary, and then he turned to his mom. Didn't even like do the turn, just like the full head turn. And he's like, how long is she gonna be here for? It's like, I don't know, about a week. He's like, good, I'm sleeping under here tonight. And he literally did it. He grabbed all of his blankets and shit and slept on the floor in the living room under the statue of the Virgin Mary.
Funny.
That's a fucking impact.
But another way to help describe what a horror, another reason I like to say horror movies can have a lasting impact on you is because it's like, all right, after you watch the movie, you go to bed, you turn the lights off. Are you thinking about that movie? Or the creature from that movie? Doesn't matter if it's supernatural, real or not.
Oh, that's a good point.
Because I know people who have that problem, and it's another reason why they refuse to watch horror movies.
My dad won't go in the ocean because of Jaws.
Yeah.
And your mom even said that about this. She wouldn't let you watch Jaws because let you watch the rest of the shit, but she wouldn't let you watch Jaws because that shit was actually real.
Exactly. Horror movies, like that's kind of why I go with this definition, because it's like they have an impact on you.
I don't know. I think it just comes down to something personal, because there's been plenty of movies that I've been impacted by that people would consider thrillers or suspense.
Well, any movie can have an impact on you, but when I say like it has an impact on you, I mean a horror impact on you. Like it leaves like this is something that you're now scared of actually happening to you.
I was going to disagree with you at first, talking about like judging thriller and horror based on how impactful it is, but when you kind of mentioned like if it's something that you kind of think of later, it ties into more of what I was going to say was horror usually has a sense of dread involved, whereas by definition, they're supposed to be scary. So of course it's going to be different for everybody else. Something that's just unsettling that you don't like. Thrillers can be action thrillers. I think it, in a way, sometimes it has to do with the speed of the movie, the energy involved.
Content.
Thriller, I actually don't really consider thrillers to be really in the scary realm. You can have horror thrillers, but with horror, I consider something like it's just the sense of dread.
Okay.
And thrillers, not. I just feel like they're generally, because they're thrilling, so they're going to be more exciting. So you can have exciting horror, a thriller horror, but horror itself would be something like an Ari Aster film. And it doesn't matter if it's supernatural or not. Like, I think Hereditary is, like, I never want to see that movie again. Midsommar, same. It's just like there's not, and sometimes it's not even necessarily something really, like, tangibly scary. It's just something that's uncomfortable, just makes you uneasy. Like I mentioned before in the podcast, like Invader Zim, it's like it's a funny show, but there's something just gross about it, and just different people maybe not affected by it, but the aesthetics of it is just kind of just gross and dirty. So I would define as, if you want to be horror, it has to be something that is at its core just uncomfortable, and you don't want to associate with it, and that could be why you think about it so much. Whether it's exciting or not, that's when it get into more like a horror thriller. So I think all horror is scary, but not all thrillers are scary, but they can definitely mesh.
It's the rectangle and the square kind of
pretty
argument.
much. But horrors, I consider horror movies, they need to have a sense of uncomfortable dread involved. And if it's faster, if it has more energy, then it's a horror thriller. Like zombie movies would be horror thriller. But even like the Romero zombies, the definition, basically the whole concept behind them and why they're so scary is because they're slow and relenting, and I think just like I still have to see it, but I know a good bit about it. Like It Follows. I think that's it's just something that is unstoppable. Or like Jason. I mean, Jason or Mike Myers. It's just some force that is always there. You can't really do anything about it. And that sense of uncomfortable dread is kind of like just something in the back of your head you can't get out. Or it's like something you're worried about, like a deadline. It's always bugging you.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas a thriller, sometimes it can be a little bit more. You got to eat it up and kind of in and then out. But horror has a sense of dread and just uncomfortableness about it.
Well, then by that notion, I'm actually curious now, because by that notion and everything else, what's the difference between Ghostface and Hannibal Lecter? I was trying to think of the most intelligent of the bunch. Mm-hmm. The what's the difference? What separates that? Because they're representations of horror and thriller by some of these examples that we're being in. So I'm trying to find out what the difference is between those two people.
I don't have an answer for that specific question, but since you brought up Hannibal Lecter, because to me, Silence of the Lambs is not horror. It just isn't.
Yeah.
It's got too much of that FBI procedural to it for it to ever be a horror movie. To me, there are horror scenes in it, but like I said before, just because you have horror scenes in your movie doesn't mean you're a horror movie. But then you look at the TV show that ran for 3 seasons, Hannibal. I would actually call that a Hannibal. I'll call that a horror show.
Okay.
Because some of the imagery they bring up and some of the just haunting hallucinations and everything that Will Graham has.
And also the fact that he's out.
Yeah.
And doing things. Like he can do things, whereas in Silence of the Lambs, again I haven't seen it, but I know the thing. Isn't he behind bars the entire movie?
Not the entire movie, but for a good part of it.
So he's not exactly immediate threat to the public. You have to go to see him.
He's also not the villain.
Yeah, correct. It's really Buffalo Bill. So maybe I asked the wrong question. What's the difference between Jason and Buffalo Bill? They're both relenting. And unstoppable. And in fact, one of them is closer to reality than the other one. So there's a lot more horror going on with what Buffalo Bill's doing and everything else. And there's a lot of procedural stuff within the show of Hannibal. It's a great show. Yeah. I need to watch more of it. It's definitely worth it. And I like him, though.
Season 2 is where it's at.
Yeah. Mad Mikkelsen, is that his name?
Yeah.
Great. I loved him since Casino Royale. Fantastic. Great at what he does. So, and I think those are just good examples of trying to find out where that, because Silence of the Lambs, to me is horror. But you guys bring up a good point, though, about how it may be a thriller with horror scenes in it, and then in my head I'm making that connection. That's fine. I think that the Buffalo Bill stuff is horrific and very horror, because that is something that could stick into, especially if I was a female and walking to the parking lot after seeing that and then seeing some dude load a van. You're like, I'm not gonna go over here by him. And that's something that could leave a lasting impression in the same way that the monsters, would in the Jasons and the Freddys of the world. So I think, that's an interesting line about what's the difference between Michael Myers and Buffalo Bill. And I think that's really where a line of where we can really understand where the difference between a thriller and a horror truly exists.
Well, it's also, you can shoot Michael Myers in the chest 6 times and he'll still get up, and you can shoot Buffalo Bill in the chest once and he's down.
Well, that's true.
I'll say for my final point, I think it has to do with the energy and the speed of it.
Okay.
Thrillers get you excited, whether you're scared or happy, whatever. Horror is slower and more cerebral and just, keep saying the word, but just dreadful. So it's more of just like a rock. I guess a horror would be like a huge boulder that you can't get over, whereas thriller is that boulder coming at you down the hill.
And I think by that notion, you're even saying that thriller and suspense is more malleable than horror.
Yes.
Horror's first intention is to horrify.
Yes.
A thriller can have multiple intentions running at the same time.
Thriller is more of an adjective than it is a genre itself.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. I'll agree with that.
I can get behind that. Yeah. I think that it's more pliable and you can plug it into multiple things. Horror at the end of the day should be horror. It should horrify you and everything else. And then it can do other things, entertain you and everything else, but its main goal is that. But a thriller can be many things. It can thrill you, it can scare you, it can excite you, it can do a lot of different things. It's more malleable and movable than the latter. So you can get behind that. Brandon?
Are we doing final thoughts?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, Colin called it, so
Yeah.
he's leading the pack on the
This
final
is
thoughts.
just my final thoughts.
Yeah.
All right, I don't know. This is one of those things where it's just like, it was either Mark or Zach brought it up. Does this line really exist? And like I said, like I never even called these thrillers until very recently, recently in my life. Like thriller was never a genre to me. It was always suspense was the genre.
Fair enough.
So I don't know. At the end of the day, do I really care what genre it is if I liked it? Probably not. Especially since it's like we're in a day and age where it's like there are a lot of things I don't consider horror that are still welcome within the horror community.
Mars Attacks.
Like Mars Attacks or The Guest. I do not consider The Guest a horror movie whatsoever. But hey, Fright Rags and Cavity Colors, they're doing shirts on it. I'll see merch for The Guest at horror conventions. It is very much welcomed within the horror community. I don't consider it a horror movie, but damn, that movie is plastered all over the horror sites and everything. So, hey, at least we know we welcome good movies. So,
It's true.
there's my cop-out answer for the day.
Zach.
Squirrels.
I almost missed that he didn't do that. I think this is a really good fucking topic. Actually, I think it's extremely thought provoking. I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said, and it's actually kind of cool that there really isn't an answer. It's just something cool to talk about. I'm glad that we didn't really. I mean, we came to a few consensus, but for the most part, like it really just comes down to is the movie good?
Genre is an illusion.
Hashtag genre doesn't exist.
God.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, if the movie's great, who gives a shit what genre it's in? I think I'm with Brandon on that one. So wonderful. So thank you so much for stopping by the Nightmares podcast. Brandon, you do this the best. Where can they find us on social media?
You can find us on our social media at Midwest Horror Network on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, and
Slasher.
And of course, you can listen to this podcast wherever podcasts are available. And in addition, if you are watching this and listening to this on YouTube, if you could be so awesome to stab that like button, smash that subscribe, and click that little dingy bell to be notified every time we drop amazing content right here on MHN. We have a lot of amazing shows. Horror Facts of the Day, Let's Play a Game. Brandon will be coming very soon with new Crypt Keeping episodes. And we also have episode 4 of Living Nightmares available now. But the most important thing, and something that you can do that's absolutely 100% free, is share the video. Share the video. We want to get the word out and talk about all the amazing things that we have going on. We have an amazing team behind us helping us out with all this great content. We want to spread the word and bring it to a bigger audience so we can still continue to have these great topics. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time on the Nightmares podcast. Bye, guys.